Hi, I'm Jessica. 3 months ago, at a table with white linens and a view of the Chicago skyline, my own sister stood up in front of a room full of important people and told them I would never amount to anything, right before the man she had spent months chasing looked straight past her and called me his lead counsel, the woman who saved his company from collapsing. It is a strange thing, watching one sentence undo years of pretending you do not need to be seen. Have you ever spent your whole life being the quiet one in your own family? The one nobody toasts at dinner while someone else takes the bow for things you actually did? If that sounds familiar, stay with me because this story still makes my chest tight every time I tell it. Before I keep going, if you have ever felt invisible in your own family, hit subscribe. It does not cost you anything, and it genuinely helps this channel keep finding and telling stories like mine. And if you want, tell me in the comments where you are listening from right now. In the car, folding laundry, lying in bed after a long shift. I read every single comment, and tonight I want to hear from you before I tell you the rest. My name is Jessica Bowen. I am 31 years old, and for the last 7 years I have worked as a senior associate in mergers and acquisitions law at a firm called Whitmore and Cole on the 32nd floor of a building in downtown Chicago. It is the kind of job most people do not understand when I try to explain it at a dinner party. So most of the time I just say I am a lawyer and let it go there. Part of that is professional habit. In my world, discretion is not a personality trait, it is a job requirement. Client names, deal numbers, the names of companies about to merge or collapse, none of it can leave the room. And after 7 years, that kind of silence stops feeling like a skill and starts feeling like your default setting, even at your own family table. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment in the West Loop, modest by the standards of what I actually earn, because I have never seen much point in performing success the way some people do. My car is 6 years old and paid off. My work bag is the same leather tote I bought myself the year I made senior associate, scuffed at the corners now, and I like it that way. Chloe, by contrast, leases a car she cannot quite afford, posts from restaurants she cannot quite afford, and somehow in the accounting that happens inside families, her visible spending has always read as success, while my quiet, steady competence read as something smaller, something almost apologetic. Simply because it did not announce itself. My sister Chloe is 2 years older than me, and she has never once had trouble being noticed. She works in luxury public relations and brand marketing, representing hotels, private clubs, and executives who want their names attached to the right kind of story. She is warm, she is loud in the best way, she photographs beautifully, and she has always known exactly how to make an entrance. Growing up, if Chloe walked into a room, the room turned toward her. I used to think that was just how some people were built, until I got older and realized it was also about who our parents chose to look at first, every single time, without ever seeming to notice they were doing it. I remember being maybe 9 years old, standing in the kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, holding a spelling test with a perfect score, waiting for my mother to look up from Chloe's dance recital schedule long enough to see it. She did, eventually. She said, "That is wonderful, sweetie." In the same breath, she was already asking Chloe if she had practiced her solo. I am not telling you this to make my mother sound cruel, because she was not. She loved us both. I am telling you this because that exact rhythm repeated itself for the next 20 years. A small delay before anyone looked at me, and a delay is its own kind of message when you hear it enough times. Even our family photo albums told the same story if you actually looked at them closely. Page after page of Chloe mid-twirl in a recital costume. Chloe holding a trophy, Chloe laughing with her arms thrown wide at some birthday party, and then, tucked in between, a handful of stiff, posed pictures of me standing slightly to the side, looking politely at the camera, the way you look at a camera when nobody told you where to stand, so you just stood wherever there was room. I used to flip through those albums as a teenager, not out of jealousy exactly, more out of a strange, quiet curiosity, trying to figure out at what age I had decided that standing to the side was simply my assigned place in every picture. By the time I finished law school, I had already become the person in my family who quietly fixed things. Not loudly, not with credit, just quietly. The way you learn to do when nobody is expecting you to be the one who solves the problem. I reviewed my father's small business contracts for free before he signed anything. I caught a clause in my parents' refinance paperwork that would have cost them $11,000 in hidden fees. Nobody asked me to do these things twice because once I did them once, it just became assumed that I would keep doing them, the same way you assume a light switch will keep working without thanking it every time you flip it. 2 years ago, Chloe called me at 11 at night, crying, saying her rent was short and her landlord was threatening to start eviction paperwork if she did not have $4,000 by Friday. I transferred it to her the next morning before I even finished my coffee. 6 months after that, when her new marketing venture needed a cushion to cover payroll for 2 freelancers, I sent another $11,000. No contract, no interest, no real conversation about when or if it would come back. $15,000 total, which does not sound like much until you remember I never once brought it up again, not because I forgot, but because bringing it up felt like it would somehow make me the difficult one. What I never told anyone was what that $15,000 actually cost me. I had been quietly saving toward a down payment on a condo near the river, the first real thing I would have ever bought for myself instead of for someone else. And that year, I simply moved the number back by about 14 months and told nobody. I picked up 2 extra client matters that spring specifically to cover the gap. Working weekends I never mentioned to my parents because mentioning it would have meant explaining why I needed to, which would have meant explaining where the money went. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet at midnight, recalculating my own timeline around my sister's emergency and feeling something curdle quietly in my chest that I did not yet have a name for. I want to be clear that I did not resent helping her, not exactly, not at first. What I resented slowly over months was the specific silence that followed every single time. Not one thank you card. Not one phone call 3 weeks later just to say things were better because of me. Just a return to the same dynamic, Chloe glowing at the center of every conversation, me quietly rebuilding a savings account nobody knew I had drained, and some small, stubborn part of me kept waiting for a version of events where somebody noticed the pattern before I had to be the one to point it out. There was one Sunday call, maybe 8 months after the second transfer, when I actually opened my mouth to say something. My mother had just spent 10 minutes describing how proud she was of Chloe for figuring out her cash flow problems on her own. Quote, nobody handed her anything, and I remember the words rising in my throat. Actual words. I paid for that, Mom. I sent the money. I have the bank transfer right here on my phone. I got as far as taking a breath. Then I heard myself say, that is great instead, and change the subject to the weather because some old tired part of me had already decided a long time ago that correcting the story out loud would cost me more than staying quiet ever had. So when Chloe called in June, practically vibrating with excitement, saying she wanted to throw a family dinner to celebrate landing what she called the biggest account of her career, I said yes the way I always said yes. She had been chasing the account of a man named Robert Sterling for almost 8 months, the chief executive of a logistics and manufacturing company called Anchorbridge Industries, and according to Chloe, she was one signature away from representing his entire personal and corporate brand. She booked a table for 8 at a restaurant downtown called the Wexford Room, the kind of place where the tasting menu costs more than most people's car payment, and she told me to wear something nice because, in her words, some important people might be there. Nobody ever mentioned the $15,000 again after I sent it, and I want to be honest about what that silence did to me over time. It is not that I expected a parade. It is that every single family conversation after that included some comment about how resourceful Chloe was, how she always found a way to make things work, while the actual mechanism of how things worked, meaning me, sitting quietly in the background, transferring money and reviewing paperwork, simply disappeared from the story. I used to lie awake doing the math in my head, not because I wanted the money back, but because I wanted just once for somebody to say out loud that it had come from somewhere. The clearest example happened at Thanksgiving the year before last. Chloe had signed a lease for a new studio space for her business, and the landlord had buried a personal guarantee clause deep in paragraph 14 that would have made her liable for the full 5-year term even if the business failed in month 2. I found it, rewrote the terms, and negotiated it down to a 6-month personal guarantee before renewal. At dinner, my father raised a glass and said he wanted to toast Chloe for being sharp enough to catch a bad contract clause before it cost her everything. Chloe smiled, said thank you, and never once looked in my direction. I smiled too, because that is what I had trained myself to do. What nobody at that Thanksgiving table knew was how much actual work sat behind that toast. I had spent 2 full evenings redlining the lease myself, then 3 separate phone calls with the landlord's attorney, a man who clearly assumed he could bury that clause and nobody would notice. Walking him line by line through why the personal guarantee language would not survive if this ever went to court, I remember the specific satisfaction of hearing his tone change on that 3rd call, the moment he realized he was not talking to someone he could steamroll. I drove home that night feeling, for once, genuinely proud of something concrete I had done. That pride lasted exactly until my father lifted his glass 3 weeks later and handed the whole story to somebody else. My parents are not villains in this story, and I want to be fair to them, because most families have some version of this same imbalance. But over and over, at every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday call, the same script played out. Chloe would mention a client dinner or a magazine feature, and my father's whole face would light up in a way I recognized but rarely saw directed at me. When I mentioned closing a deal that saved a company from bankruptcy, my mother would say, "That sounds important, honey," and immediately ask if I was seeing anyone, as if my career was a placeholder conversation until the real subject came up. At a family reunion in Dayton 2 summers ago, an aunt I only see once a year asked me what I had been up to, and before I could answer, my mother jumped in and said, "Oh, Jessica is still doing her lawyer thing, very serious, very boring. We never really understand half of what she does." She meant it fondly, I think, the way you tease a child about a hobby, except I was 30 years old, and the hobby in question was a career that supported an entire practice group at one of the largest firms in the Midwest. My aunt laughed, patted my hand, and asked if I had tried the potato salad, and that was the entire conversation about my career that year. The week I passed the bar exam, I called my parents from the parking lot outside the testing center, still shaking with relief. And my mother answered already mid-conversation about a magazine that wanted to photograph Chloe's apartment for a feature on young professionals to watch. She congratulated me warmly enough. Genuinely, I do not doubt that. But the call lasted maybe 90 seconds before she said she had to go help Chloe pick out throw pillows for the photo shoot. I sat in my car for a long time afterward, not crying exactly, just sitting with the strange, hollow feeling of having cleared one of the hardest hurdles of my life and somehow still coming in second place in my own family's attention that same afternoon. Chloe had a specific vocabulary she used for what I did, and she used it so consistently I think she genuinely believed it was accurate. She called it my little office job. She called it paperwork. Once, at a cousin's wedding, when someone asked what I did for work, she answered for me before I could open my mouth, saying, "Oh, Jessica does contracts. It is very behind the scenes, very unglamorous, but somebody has to do it." She said it kindly, almost affectionately, which somehow made it worse, because it meant she was not even trying to insult me. She genuinely saw my career as smaller than hers, and she was comfortable saying so in front of strangers. That was not the only time it happened in public. At a mutual friend's engagement party the previous spring, Chloe introduced me to one of her actual clients, a hotel owner she had been trying to sign for months, by saying, "This is my sister. She does something with contracts downtown," and then immediately pivoting the conversation back to a rooftop bar opening she was organizing. The hotel owner smiled politely, said that sounds nice, and never asked another question, because Chloe had already made it clear there was nothing else worth asking about. I stood there holding a glass of champagne I did not want, doing what I always did, smiling, saying nothing, filing it away with the rest. Here is the part I did not understand about myself until much later. My silence at home was not separate from my silence at work. It was the same muscle. In my job, I am trained to hold information, to let other people take the microphone in a negotiation while I do the work that actually determines the outcome. Senior partners get their names on the press release. I get a line item in a closing binder nobody reads except other lawyers. I had convinced myself that this was simply my personality, that I was naturally private, naturally modest. It took me years to admit that I had just built a very convincing professional excuse for a wound that started at my mother's kitchen table. I started seeing a therapist about 2 years before that dinner, mostly because I could not sleep and kept blaming it on work stress, and it took nearly 4 months of sessions before I finally said out loud, almost by accident, that I did not think anyone in my family had ever really looked at me without also looking past me at the same time. My therapist asked a simple question that stayed with me for a long time afterward. She asked what would happen if you stopped making it so easy for them. I did not have an answer that day. I think in a strange way the answer finally arrived 3 months ago at a table with white linens delivered by a man who had no idea he was even part of the question. I even saw the same pattern play out at my own firm, which should have been the first clue that this was not just a family problem. A senior partner once presented an entire restructuring strategy I had built almost single-handedly to a client, using slides I had drafted, language I had written, and mentioned my name exactly once, in passing, as someone who helped pull together the materials. I remember sitting in the back of that conference room thinking, this feels familiar, this feels like Thanksgiving, this feels like every toast my father has ever given. And it was the first time I let myself wonder whether the problem was not that I was quiet by nature, but that I had simply never been taught it was allowed to be any other way. There was a spring 3 years ago when our father's small hardware business in Dayton nearly lost its lease because of a zoning dispute with the city. I spent 11 weekend hours researching the ordinance, drafted a variance request, and personally called the city planning office twice to walk them through it. The business kept its lease. At the family barbecue that summer, my father told the story to our uncle as if he had handled it himself, mentioning almost as an afterthought that Jessica helped a little with some paperwork. Some paperwork. 11 weekends of my own time, reduced to a phrase he used the same way you would describe someone holding a door open. I remember the actual texture of those 11 weekends more clearly than I remember most vacations. Saturday mornings at my kitchen table with a laptop and 3 cups of coffee going cold, printouts of the municipal code covered in yellow highlighter, calling the planning office twice and getting transferred both times before I finally reached someone who could actually answer a zoning question. Nobody called to ask how it was going. Nobody brought me coffee or asked if I needed help. I did it alone, the way I did almost everything for that family, and when it was finished, I drove back to Chicago on a Sunday night with a strange, quiet ache in my chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with being unseen, and I did not have a single person to tell about the exhaustion, because the whole point of the work was that nobody was supposed to notice it happened at all. So there I was, 3 months ago, walking into the Wexford room in a navy dress I had bought specifically because it was quiet and well-made, the kind of thing that says competent without saying anything at all. My parents were already seated, my father in his good blazer, my mother wearing the pearl earrings she saves for weddings and funerals. Chloe arrived 12 minutes late in a shimmering emerald dress, a new rose gold watch catching the light every time she moved her wrist, practically glowing with the kind of energy she gets when she believes her life is about to change. She kissed everyone on the cheek, sat down, and immediately started talking about Robert Sterling like she had known him for years. The Wexford room was the kind of place designed to make you feel slightly out of your depth the moment you walked through the door. Dim gold lighting, a sommelier who spoke about wine the way other people talk about the weather, a doorman who greeted Chloe by name because she had clearly been there before, angling for exactly this moment. The tasting menu that night ran $410 a person before wine pairings, a number my father quietly mentioned to me under his breath with raised eyebrows, though he never said a word about it to Chloe, who had insisted on the restaurant and was notably not the one whose card would be paying for it. Chloe explained to the table in great detail how she had been cultivating the Anchor Bridge account since the previous fall, how she had gotten Robert Sterling's assistant to put her on his calendar 3 separate times, how she had sent him a handwritten note after their last meeting because, quote, powerful men remember the personal touch. She said the words almost closing so many times that my father started repeating it back to her like a toast, almost closing the biggest deal of her career, almost closing the account that would change everything for her firm. I nodded along, ordered a glass of wine, and said nothing because that particular story had never once been about needing my input. The sommelier came by our table twice that evening, once to walk Chloe through a wine pairing she clearly chose specifically because it photographed well a pale rose she held up to the candlelight for a picture before she had even tasted it, and once to quietly ask my father in a lower voice whether the kitchen should be made aware of anyone's allergies before the tasting menu began. My father, flustered, deferred the question to Chloe, who waved it off with a laugh and said, "Everyone at this table can handle whatever they put in front of us. We are not that fussy." A small throwaway line that nonetheless managed to make even the sommelier's professional courtesy feel like it belonged to her performance instead of a genuine question about our safety. What none of them knew, because I have never once discussed a client by name at a family dinner in my entire career, was that Anchorbridge Industries was not a stranger to me. 8 months earlier, my firm had represented Robert Sterling personally through the single most complicated acquisition of his career, the purchase of a struggling competitor called Delacroix Systems. I had spent 4 months buried in due diligence documents, and 3 weeks before closing, I found a hidden indemnification clause that would have exposed him to $80 million in liability he did not know existed. I restructured the entire deal around that discovery. I did not say a word of this at the table. It was not mine to say, and honestly, some old habit in me still did not think it mattered. Halfway through the appetizers, Chloe turned to me with the specific smile she uses when she's about to say something under the cover of a joke. She asked how the paperwork business was going, then laughed and told the table that she had tried to explain my job to a client once and gave up halfway through because, in her words, nobody wants to hear about contracts at a dinner party. A few people at the table laughed politely. I laughed too, the practiced laugh, the one that costs nothing and protects everything, and I told myself it was just Chloe being Chloe, the way I had told myself that same sentence for 20 years. The table was not just family that night. Chloe had invited 2 colleagues from her agency and a woman named Patricia Renner, who ran public relations for a hospitality group Chloe was trying to court as a second client. These were exactly the kind of people Chloe most wanted to impress. Polished, well-connected, watching everything. I understood, sitting there, that this dinner was never really a celebration for our family. It was a stage Chloe had built, and we were the supporting cast, meant to make her look successful, grounded and beloved in front of an audience that mattered to her career. I noticed small things that night that I do not think anyone else at the table registered, because noticing small things is essentially my entire job. The way Chloe angled her chair very slightly toward the restaurant entrance all evening, so she would see anyone important the moment they walked in. The way she kept checking her phone under the table, refreshing an email thread with Robert Sterling's assistant that had gone unanswered for 4 days, though she described it to Patricia as, "We are just finalizing some details." The way her laugh got a half step louder every time someone at a nearby table glanced our way. I had spent 7 years reading rooms for a living, and that room was telling me a very different story than the one Chloe was narrating out loud. Part of me almost wanted to warn her quietly under the table that Robert Sterling was not a man who let anyone rush a relationship, professional or otherwise, that I had sat across from him in 4 separate negotiations and watched him take 3 weeks just to approve a font change on a shareholder letter. Whatever Chloe believed she had with him, built on one lunch and a handwritten note, was not the foundation she thought it was. I did not say any of this. It was not my place, and some part of me, the part still trained to stay small, told myself it was none of my business how the evening ended for her. As the entrees arrived, Chloe made a second comment, sharper than the first, saying she sometimes worried people would assume our whole family lacked ambition just because, and here she gestured vaguely in my direction, some of us were content to just do the quiet, safe thing forever. Patricia laughed. My mother gave a small, uncomfortable smile and quickly changed the subject to the bread. I felt my face go warm, that specific heat that climbs your neck before you even fully register the insult. And I gripped my fork a little tighter and reminded myself, the way I always did, that reacting would only give her a bigger story to tell. I want to be honest about what was happening inside me during those minutes, because it was not calm, no matter how calm my face looked. There is a specific kind of anger that does not show up as heat. It shows up as stillness, a very precise, very quiet counting of every single time you have been dismissed, stacking one on top of the last, like bricks. I thought about the $11,000. I thought about my father's toast to Chloe's sharp instincts on a contract I had rewritten myself. I thought about some paperwork, 11 weekends reduced to 5 syllables. And I thought, watching her laugh at her own joke, that I was so tired, not of her, but of my own silence. And then, glancing past Chloe's shoulder toward the bar, I recognized a face I had not expected to see in that room. Elaine Whitmore, the name partner at my own firm, the woman who had personally supervised me through the Anchorbridge Delacroix deal, was seated 2 tables away with a client, clearly in the middle of her own dinner meeting. Our eyes met for half a second. She gave me the smallest, most professional nod, the kind 2 colleagues exchange when neither wants to interrupt the other's evening. I had no idea yet how much that small nod was about to matter, but something in my chest loosened slightly. Just knowing someone in that room actually knew who I was. I excused myself to the restroom a few minutes later, less because I needed to, and more because I needed 30 seconds where nobody was looking at me at all. On my way back, I passed close enough to Elaine's table that she caught my sleeve gently and asked quietly if I was all right. I told her it was just a long family dinner. She studied my face for a moment, the way she studies a contract when she suspects there is a clause buried somewhere she has not found yet, and said, "Whatever is happening at that table, do not you dare shrink yourself over it. You built something real this year. Do not let anyone at that table tell you otherwise." I sat back down and tried to settle into the rest of the dinner, but Chloe was not finished. Emboldened by the wine and by Patricia's attentive laughter, she started telling a longer story about a difficult client meeting, using it as a way to circle back, again, to how demanding her job was compared to mine. She said something about how some people get to hide behind a desk their whole career and never have to actually perform under pressure in front of important people. My father chuckled. My mother did not correct her. I felt something in me go very still and very clear, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm actually arrives. Chloe kept turning her wrist throughout the meal, so the new rose gold watch caught the candlelight, mentioning twice that Robert Sterling had complimented her taste when they last met, as if that single sentence from him was proof of an intimacy I already knew did not exist. She talked about the black car service Anchorbridge used to send for meetings, the private dining room at their headquarters, the way Robert Sterling always ordered the same thing, a detail she recited like she had memorized it from a single lunch 3 months earlier and was determined to make it sound like a closeness she had spent a decade building. At one point, she slid her wrist across the table toward my mother, tilting the watch so the candlelight caught the rose gold face just right, and said she had bought it for herself as, quote, a preemptive celebration because she just knew in her gut this deal was going to close. $1,100, she mentioned, unprompted, the way people do when the number itself is the point of the sentence. I thought quietly about the $15,000 I had never once turned into a story worth telling at a dinner table, and I felt that same old stillness settle back into my chest, the counting kind, the kind that does not show up on your face at all. Near the end of the entrees, our server leaned toward Chloe and mentioned, with the particular reverence restaurant staff reserve for their most important guests, that a private dining room down the hall was being prepared for a 9 o'clock reservation under the name Sterling. Chloe's whole face transformed. She grabbed my mother's arm and said, "Oh my goodness, that has to be him. He mentioned he loved this place. This is fate. This is exactly the kind of coincidence that changes a career." She spent the next 20 minutes checking her reflection in a spoon and rehearsing, out loud, exactly how she would casually happen to run into him near the entrance. It was somewhere in that stretch of nervous excitement that Chloe turned the full weight of her attention back onto me, and I think, looking back, she needed somewhere to put her own anxiety about the coming meeting, and I was the easiest target in the room. She said loudly enough for the whole table and Patricia and both agency colleagues to hear that she really hoped I had dressed appropriately if we ran into anyone important tonight because, and I am quoting her directly, you cannot exactly show up looking like you shop at a discount outlet next to people who actually matter. She was not finished there either. She turned to Patricia with a little laugh and added that it was probably for the best I was still single, since between the two of us, she had always been the one who understood how to actually present herself in a room like this. My mother let out a small, nervous laugh, the kind that is meant to smooth over an insult rather than call it one. Nobody at that table said, "That is not fair, Chloe," not one person. And I remember thinking with a kind of clarity I had never let myself have before, that this was not one bad night. This was the family's actual position on me, stated out loud in public for the first time in years. 28 years of small delays and quiet toast for other people had finally condensed into one plain sentence, spoken in front of strangers who mattered to my sister's career. And there was something almost clarifying about hearing it said so nakedly after so many years of it only ever being implied. Then she kept going, and I could feel every word land like a small, deliberate stone. She said I should probably let her do the talking if Robert Sterling came by because, in her exact words, you basically just do paperwork nobody remembers. You are never going to actually get anywhere doing what you do. And honestly, sweetie, you should feel a little embarrassed sitting here in that outfit next to people who are actually building something with their lives. Patricia laughed softly into her wineglass. My father looked down at his plate. My mother said, Chloe quietly but did not say anything else, and I just sat there, in silence, the way I always had. I want to tell you exactly what that silence felt like from the inside, because I think it matters. It was not numbness. Every word she said landed somewhere specific, the outlet comment in my stomach, the paperwork comment in my throat, the you should feel embarrassed comment somewhere lower, somewhere older, somewhere that had been waiting 20 years for someone to finally say the quiet part out loud at full volume. My hands were steady around my water glass. My face held the same practiced, pleasant expression it always held. But underneath the tablecloth, out of sight, I had pressed my thumbnail so hard into my palm that it left a small crescent mark I noticed later in the car under the streetlight. I did not throw my napkin down. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories usually go in movies with a big speech and a dramatic exit. That is not what happened. What happened instead was quieter and, I think, more permanent. Something in me simply finished a long, slow calculation it had been running my entire life and arrived at an answer. I was done being grateful for scraps of attention from people who only valued me when it was convenient. I did not know yet how the next 10 minutes would prove that decision right in a way I could never have scripted myself. I want to pause the story right here for 1 second. If you have ever sat at a table and swallowed something like that, smiling because the alternative felt worse, please subscribe to this channel right now because we tell these stories for exactly that reason, to remind you that being underestimated is not the same as being small. It costs nothing, it takes 5 seconds, and it genuinely helps more people find these stories. Okay, now let me tell you what happened next, because this is the part I still think about. Before I could even fully absorb what Chloe had said, I felt a hand rest briefly on the back of my chair. Eleni had walked past on her way to the restroom, and she paused just long enough to lean down and say, very quietly, so only I could hear it, "Do not you dare apologize for who you are at this table. You are about to remind everyone in this room exactly what you are worth, whether they are ready to hear it or not." Then she straightened up and walked on, as if nothing had happened at all, leaving me sitting there with my heart suddenly pounding for a completely different reason. That is the moment something in me actually turned, not just endured, turned. And before I tell you what happened in the next 5 minutes, I want to ask a real favor. If this story is landing for you the way I hope it is, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep going. And if you have a similar moment where somebody finally saw you clearly, drop it in the comments. I promise I will read it. Okay, here is where everything changed. At exactly 9 o'clock, the front of the restaurant stirred the way rooms do when someone important walks in. I glanced up along with half the dining room and saw a tall man in a charcoal suit, silver at the temples, moving through the space with the unhurried calm of someone who never has to rush because people simply wait for him. Chloe practically levitated out of her chair, smoothing her dress, already rehearsing her opening line. But Robert Sterling did not walk toward Chloe. He walked directly toward our table, his eyes locked on me, and said with real warmth in his voice, "Jessica Bowen, I did not expect to see you here tonight of all places." The whole table went silent in a way I can still feel in my chest when I think about it. Robert Sterling reached out and shook my hand and said, loud enough for everyone at that table and the two nearby to hear, "This is my lead counsel, the woman who saved the entire Delacroix acquisition when everyone else missed a clause that would have cost me $80 million. I still tell that story in board meetings. Jessica, I owe you more than you probably realize." He held my hand a moment longer, smiled and added, "If you are ever looking to make a move, my company would be lucky to have you in-house." I watched Chloe's face change in real time, watched the exact moment the story she had built for months, the almost closing, the handwritten notes, the assistant who let her in 3 times, collapse under the simple fact that Robert Sterling had walked past her without a flicker of recognition. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. One of Chloe's colleagues glanced sideways at her, then back at Robert, then back at her again, doing the exact same math everyone else at that table was suddenly doing in silence. Robert, still holding my hand, glanced politely at the rest of the table, and my father, flustered, introduced everyone, mentioning that Chloe worked in public relations. Robert nodded pleasantly, said it was nice to meet her, and then, without any malice at all, simply because it was true, said he did not believe they had met before, though he understood Anchorbridge's marketing team had been fielding a lot of outreach lately. Chloe opened her mouth and nothing came out. The almost closing deal she had described in such detail for the last 2 hours had just been revealed, in front of everyone she most wanted to impress, as something that had never actually started. For a moment, nobody at the table moved. I remember the specific sound of the restaurant continuing around us. Silverware, low conversation, someone laughing 2 tables over, while our little corner of the room sat frozen in a silence that felt like it lasted much longer than it actually did. Patricia's expression had shifted from polite interest into something closer to reassessment. The look you give someone when you realize the story they sold you was never quite true. I did not look at Chloe with satisfaction. If anything, in that first second, I felt a strange, unexpected flicker of protectiveness toward her. The old habit of wanting to smooth things over before I remembered deliberately to just let the moment exist. My mother's hand went to her chest. My father looked at me the way you look at a familiar room after someone finally turns the lights on, like he was seeing furniture that had been there the whole time, and he had simply never noticed it before. Nobody said the word paperwork again for the rest of that dinner. Robert stayed only another minute, mentioned he would have his office reach out to schedule that conversation about bringing me in-house, squeezed my shoulder once, and continued on toward his private dining room, leaving a silence behind him that felt heavier than anything Chloe had said all night. Across the room, Elaine caught my eye one more time, and this time she did not bother hiding her expression. A small, satisfied smile, the kind a mentor gives you when a room finally sees what she already knew. She raised her water glass an inch off the table, just for me, just for that half second, and I understood it as clearly as if she had said the words out loud. "I told you. Now stop apologizing for it." I held her gaze for a moment, then turned back to my own table, where the entire shape of the evening had rearranged itself around a single sentence spoken by a man who had no idea what he had just done for me. I want you to know I did not gloat. I did not turn to Chloe and say anything cutting, even though every humiliating comment from the last 2 hours was sitting right there, available to use. I simply took a slow sip of water, met my sister's eyes for exactly 1 second, and said quietly, "It is just paperwork, Chloe. You said so yourself and let the silence do the rest of the work I no longer needed to do myself." Some victories do not need a speech. They just need everyone at the table to finally see clearly what was true the entire time. Chloe excused herself to the restroom almost immediately, and did not come back to the table for nearly 15 minutes. When she did, her makeup was carefully redone and her voice was smaller than I had heard it in years. Nobody mentioned the incident directly for the rest of the meal. Patricia left early, citing an early meeting, though we all understood the real reason. My parents paid the check that night without the usual argument about splitting it, and on the walk to the car, my father put his hand on my shoulder and simply said, "I did not know, Jessica, I am sorry. I did not know." I did not say it is okay, because it was not, and for once I let the silence between us stay honest instead of smoothing it over the way I always had. I just nodded and we kept walking toward the car, past the doorman who had greeted Chloe by name 2 hours earlier and now would not meet anyone's eyes, past a valet retrieving somebody else's expensive car, the whole glittering machinery of the evening still running around us as if nothing inside our family had just quietly rearranged itself. The drive back to my parents' hotel was almost completely silent, and I remember staring out the window at the lit-up skyline, feeling strangely calm, not triumphant, just calm, the way you feel after finally putting down something heavy you had been carrying so long, you forgot it had weight. Chloe sat in the back seat, staring at her phone, saying nothing. I did not feel the need to fill that silence with forgiveness or with cruelty either. I just let it exist, because for the first time in a long time, the silence was not mine to manage. 2 weeks later, Chloe called and asked carefully if I could help cover a shortfall for a new client contract. The same kind of request I had said yes to a dozen times before without a second thought. I told her no, not coldly, just clearly. I said I loved her, but I was not going to keep quietly funding her business while she described my career as something to be embarrassed about in front of her clients. She was quiet for a long moment, then said she understood, though I could hear in her voice that some part of her still expected me to fold, the way I always had. I did not fold. A few weeks after that call, my mother tried a different approach, mentioning almost casually that Chloe was under a lot of pressure lately and could really use some support from her big sister, emotional support, financial support, whatever I could manage. I told my mother, gently but plainly, that I loved Chloe and that I would always show up for her in an actual emergency, but that quietly funding her business decisions while she told clients I did unglamorous paperwork was not support. It was just a one-way arrangement I had finally stopped agreeing to. My mother was quiet on the phone for a moment, then said, "I think I understand that better than I used to." A month after that, my father called about another issue with the hardware store's insurance policy, clearly expecting me to quietly take care of it the way I always had. I want to say clearly that setting these boundaries did not feel triumphant in the moment, the way it might sound telling it now. It felt uncomfortable, almost rude, like I was breaking some unspoken family rule that had kept everything running smoothly for 30 years. There was a version of me, even a few months earlier, who would have caved on that insurance call within the first 10 seconds simply to avoid the discomfort of my father sounding disappointed. Learning to sit inside that discomfort without immediately fixing it for everyone else turned out to be its own kind of work, harder in some ways than any contract I have ever negotiated, because there was no clear precedent to follow, no case law, just me deciding moment by moment that I was allowed to exist as something other than the family's quiet utility. This time, I told him I would be happy to recommend a lawyer who specialized in that specific area, but that I could not keep doing unpaid legal work for the family and then hear it described later as some paperwork I helped a little with. He was surprised then. To his credit, he apologized, genuinely, and said he had never really thought about it that way before, that he had just gotten used to me being the one who quietly made problems disappear. I gave him the name of a solid attorney 2 towns over, someone I had actually worked opposite years earlier and trusted. And I made a point of telling my father clearly that I expected him to actually pay her standard rate, the way he would pay any other professional he hired. He did. It cost him around $1,800 to resolve the insurance issue that year, a fraction of what I had quietly absorbed for the family over the previous decade. And I remember feeling something settle in me the first time I heard him mention, almost proudly, that he had hired a real lawyer to handle it properly this time, as if the idea of paying for expertise had become, for the first time, something he respected rather than something he simply expected for free from his own daughter. I want to be honest with you, this did not turn into some tidy movie reconciliation, where Chloe hugged me crying and thanked me for everything. What actually happened was smaller and, I think, more honest. My parents started asking more questions about my actual work, real questions, not polite ones. My mother mentioned my job to a neighbor, unprompted, with something like pride in her voice, which was new. Chloe and I are civil, sometimes even warm, but there's a new, quiet respect between us that was not there before, the kind that only shows up after somebody stops being allowed to walk all over you for free. Christmas that year looked different in small, specific ways nobody would have noticed except me. My father asked me, in front of the whole table, to explain what exactly a merger involved and actually listen to the answer instead of glancing at his phone halfway through. My mother put one photo of me at my law school graduation into the new photo album she was making, right next to a picture of Chloe at a launch party. The first time in years the two of us had appeared as equals on facing pages instead of one crowding out the other. Nobody made a speech about it. Nobody needed to. I just noticed quietly the way I notice everything and let myself feel something close to peace about it. Robert Sterling's office did call exactly as he said they would. And while I ultimately chose to stay at Whitmore & Cole because I genuinely love the work, that single phone call did something for me that 15 years of family dinners had never managed to do. It confirmed in plain, undeniable terms that the work I had spent my whole career doing quietly actually mattered to someone whose opinion the whole room happened to respect. I did not need his validation to know my own worth, but I will not pretend it did not feel good to have it stated out loud. In that room, in front of exactly the people who needed to hear it, Elaine called me the following Monday, ostensibly about an unrelated matter, and near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, she said she had heard through the partnership grapevine that I was being quietly considered for early promotion to partner, 2 years ahead of the usual track, and that Robert Sterling's comments about the Delacroix deal, repeated back to our managing partner by someone at another table that night, had not exactly hurt my case. I sat at my desk after that call for a long moment, thinking about how strange it was that the same evening my family finally saw me clearly was also the evening my career quietly shifted onto a faster track, as if the universe had decided one dinner could carry 2 long overdue corrections at once. Before I tell you the last part of this, I want to say one more time, if any part of this story reminded you of your own family, your own quiet years of being the reliable one nobody thanked, please subscribe to this channel. It genuinely helps us keep finding and sharing stories like mine, and it means more than you know that you are still here listening. These days I still help my family when they need it, but I help them the way you help people you respect, not the way you help people to earn a seat at their table. I send a bill sometimes now, a real one, and nobody has argued. I speak up in family conversations instead of shrinking into the practiced smile I wore for 20 years. And Chloe, to her credit, has stopped introducing me as the one who does paperwork. She actually asked me a few weeks ago, quietly, without an audience, what exactly I do all day. I told her. She listened, really listened, for the first time I can remember. We were sitting in my apartment, not a restaurant. Not in front of anyone she needed to perform for. Just the two of us on my couch with takeout containers open on the coffee table, and I walked her through what a due diligence process actually looks like. What it means to find a clause buried on page 200 that could cost someone $80 million. What it feels like to be the last person standing between a client and a catastrophe nobody else even noticed was coming. She was quiet for a while afterward, then said, I think I have spent our whole lives assuming quiet meant small. I did not say anything clever back. I just nodded because it was true, and because for the first time, saying it out loud seemed to actually cost her something. She also, unprompted, brought up the $15,000 that night, said she had thought about it more than she ever let on, and that she was going to start paying me back in monthly installments starting the following month, whether I wanted her to or not. I told her she did not have to. She said she knew that. That was exactly why she was going to do it anyway. It was a small gesture, a few $100s a month, nothing that changes either of our lives financially, but it was the first time in a decade she had treated something I did for her as a debt worth acknowledging instead of a favor that simply evaporated once it stopped being useful to her. If there is one thing I would want you to take from all of this, it is that being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best is one of the loneliest kinds of pain there is, because you cannot even explain it to anyone without sounding bitter or ungrateful. But your worth was never actually up for a vote at that dinner table. It was true the whole time, whether or not anyone chose to notice it. I think about that thumbnail crescent mark my nail left in my own palm sometimes, and how strange it is that the moment I finally stopped shrinking did not look dramatic from the outside at all. Nobody watching me that night would have seen a woman about to change the entire shape of her life. They would have just seen someone quietly sipping water, saying almost nothing, while the whole room rearranged itself around a truth that had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for someone powerful enough to say it out loud. Most real turning points look like that. Quiet, almost invisible, until suddenly they are not. You do not need a powerful man to walk into a restaurant and say your name out loud for your work to matter. I got that moment, and I'm grateful for it. But I do not think I needed it anymore by the time it happened. I think I had already decided somewhere between the 15th quiet favor and that dinner table that I was done asking permission to be seen. I still think sometimes about how different that night could have gone if Robert Sterling had simply chosen a different restaurant, or arrived 20 minutes later after we had already left, or never walked past our table at all. Chloe would have gone home still believing her own story. My parents would have kept toasting her instincts while quietly forgetting mine, and I probably would have kept absorbing it the way I always had for another year, another decade, telling myself it was simply my nature to stay quiet. The truth would have remained true either way. It just would have taken longer and cost me more for anyone else to finally notice it. So if you are the quiet one in your family, the reliable one, the one who fixes things and never gets the toast, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not have to wait for someone else's recognition to know what you are worth. Set the boundary. Say the number out loud. Stop apologizing for a career, a choice, a life that is actually yours. Thank you so much for listening to my story all the way to the end. It genuinely means a lot to me. If it moved you even a little, please consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep telling stories exactly like mine. I will see you in the next one.